The alarms woke Minho from a deep sleep, and he rolled out of bed reaching for his boots before his mind fully processed what was happening. And red emergency lights flashed in his quarters on Titan Station, and the intercom crackled to life, and Admiral Soman's voice cut through the chaos, and she announced that Torvan forces had attacked 3 outer colonies, and all military personnel were to report to their stations immediately, and civilian transport was suspended until further notice. And Minho pulled on his uniform and ran toward the command center, and around him the entire station had erupted into controlled chaos. Admiral Soman stood in the command center surrounded by holographic displays showing ship positions and casualty reports and tactical data, and she was 50 years old with silver hair pulled back tight, and she had served in Earth's military for 30 years, and she had never expected to command forces in an actual war, and she looked up as Minho entered and recognized him from the test reports and gestured him over and told him that humanity was under attack, and the Galactic Council had refused to intervene and cited their non-interference policy, and Earth stood alone and she needed every capable person ready to fight. Jisoo arrived moments later, and behind her came Doyen, and his face was grim, and he already wore his combat armor, and Admiral Soman briefed them quickly and explained that the Torvan Empire had sent a fleet of 60 warships, and they had overwhelmed the colony defenses in hours, and orbital bombardments had killed thousands, and ground forces were hunting survivors. And Earth's navy was scrambling to respond, but they were outnumbered 3-1, and the Torvan had better weapons and shields. And humanity's only advantage was that they could take more damage and keep fighting. The first engagement happened near Saturn's rings, and Minho piloted a fast attack craft, and Jisoo served as his engineer and maintained the ship's systems, and their squadron consisted of 12 human ships against 30 Torvan cruisers, and the EB battle began with long-range missile exchanges, and Minho dodged incoming fire and returned shots when he had clear targeting. And beside him, Jisoo called out shield status and power distribution, and a Torvan plasma bolt struck their port side, and the ship shuddered and alarms screamed, and Minho felt the heat even through the hull, and he compensated and kept flying. Doyen was part of the boarding teams, and when human ships disabled Torvan vessels, his squad would breach and secure them. And the first boarding action was brutal, and the Torvan were reptilian and stood 8 feet tall, with scales like armor, and claws that could tear through metal. And Doyen's squad fought them hand-to-hand in the cramped corridors, and plasma fire lit the darkness, and Doyen took a bolt to his shoulder that burned through his armor and seared his flesh. And the pain was blinding, but he switched his weapon to his other hand and kept fighting. And his body released adrenaline and endorphins that dulled the pain and sharpened his focus. The Torvan soldiers had never fought humans before, and they expected their enemies to fall when injured and stay down, and instead they watched in growing horror as human soldiers took wounds that should have been fatal and kept advancing, and one Torvan warrior shot a human 3 times in the chest, and the human fell, and the Torvan moved past him to engage others, and then the fallen human stood back up and shot the Torvan in the back, and the Torvan's dying. Thought was confusion, because no species should be able to survive chest wounds. Minho's squadron lost 4 ships in the first engagement, and the remaining 8 ships were damaged and limping back to Titan Station, and Minho's craft had burns across the hull, and 1 engine was barely functioning, and Jisoo had burns on her, arms from an electrical fire, and she had put out the fire and rerouted power and kept them flying. And when they docked at the station, medical teams rushed to assist, and Jisoo waved them away and said she was fine, and other people needed help. Moore and Minho saw the burns and insisted she get treatment, and she reluctantly agreed. Kyung was a medic who had trained on Earth and volunteered for frontline service, and she worked in Titan Station's medical bay and treated an endless stream of casualties, and she had seen terrible injuries during her training, but nothing prepared her for what she witnessed during the war, and soldiers came to her with burns and broken bones and missing limbs and gunshot wounds, and she patched them up and sent them back to fight. And what amazed her was how quickly they healed and how eager they were to return to combat. And one soldier came in with a piece of shrapnel embedded in his lung, and she removed it and sealed the wound, and he was back on duty within 8 hours. The Torvan Empire's commander, Kroll, reviewed the battle reports from his flagship, and he was confused and angry because his forces had superior numbers and better technology, and yet they were not achieving the decisive victories he expected, and human ships that should have been destroyed kept fighting, and human soldiers that should have been dead kept killing his warriors. and he called his intelligence officers and demanded to know why the reports about human durability had been so drastically underestimated, and the officers had no good answers, and Krall decided he would need to see these humans for himself. The second wave of Torvan attacks targeted supply lines and tried to cut off Earth from its outer colonies, and Minho's squadron was assigned to escort duty and protect cargo vessels, and they jumped into a system and found it already under attack. And 6 Torvan cruisers were firing on civilian transports, and Minho ordered his squadron to engage, and they dove into the fight, and Minho's targeting systems locked onto the lead Torvan ship and fired missiles, and the missiles struck home and punched through the Torvan shields, and explosions rippled across its hull. Jisu's console exploded and threw her backward, and shrapnel cut her face and arms and embedded in her chest, and she gasped and tasted blood, and her vision went gray, and Minho shouted her name and wanted to help her, but he had to fly the ship. And Jisu forced herself to focus, and she pulled the shrapnel from her chest with shaking hands, and blood poured from the wounds, and she pressed her hand against the worst injury, and her body's clotting factors activated immediately, and within seconds the bleeding slowed, and she grabbed medical tape from the emergency kit and sealed the wounds and got back to her station. The convoy escaped, and Minho jumped his ship back to Titan Station and carried Jisu to the medical bay. And Kyung examined her and shook her head in amazement, because the wounds should have killed her, and instead, they were already healing, and Kyung cleaned and bandaged everything properly and told Jisu she needed to rest for at least 2 days, and Jisu said she would rest for 2 hours, and then she was going back on duty, and Kyung started to argue but saw the determination in Jisu's eyes and simply nodded. Doyen's boarding team hit a Torvan supply depot, and the mission was to destroy their ammunition stores, and they dropped from orbit in stealth pods and landed in the middle of the enemy compound, and fighting was immediate and intense, and Doyen kicked in a door and found himself face to face with Commander Krall. And Krall was massive and covered in scars and held a plasma blade that glowed white-hot, and he looked at Doyen and said in perfect galactic standard that finally he could test a human personally. They fought in the narrow corridor, and Krall was fast despite his size, and his blade cut through Doyen's armor and sliced across his ribs, and Doyen felt his skin split and blood flow, and he rolled away and fired his weapon, and Krall's shields absorbed the shots, and Krall laughed and said that humans were weak, and Doyen charged forward and tackled Krall, and they crashed through a wall and fell into the depot's main storage area, and Doyen landed hard and felt ribs crack, and Krall stood over him and raised his blade for a killing strike. Doyen grabbed a piece of broken metal from the floor and swung it with all his strength, and caught Krall across the knee, and the Torvan commander stumbled, and Doyen rolled to his feet, and his broken ribs ground against each other, and the pain was excruciating. But his body flooded with endorphins, and he felt the pain fade to a distant thing, and he pressed his advantage and attacked relentlessly, and drove Krall backward, and Krall's expression changed from confidence to concern, because this human should be dying from his injuries, and instead he was fighting harder. The rest of Doyen's team found them, and they opened fire on Krall and forced him to retreat, and Krall activated a personal teleporter and vanished, and Doyen collapsed to his knees and finally allowed himself to feel the pain, and his squad medic crushed over and scanned him and reported multiple broken ribs and internal bleeding and severe lacerations, and Doyen waved him off and said to plant the charges and complete the mission, and they could treat him on the transport, and the medic protested, but Doyen was the ranking officer, and he pulled himself to his feet and helped place the explosives. Back on Titan Station, Admiral Soman gathered her senior officers and reviewed their tactical situation, and the news was not good, and the Torvan were winning through attrition, and humanity could heal from injuries, but they could still die if overwhelmed, and they were running low on ships and ammunition and supplies, and Earth's industrial base was. The space above Earth's moon erupted into violence and fire, and Minho's squadron dove into the Torvan formation, and weapons fire lit the darkness like artificial stars, and Admiral Soman's voice crackled over the command channel, and she gave the order to drop shields, and every human pilot obeyed without hesitation, and the Torvan forces saw the shields fall, and thought humanity had made a fatal mistake, and they pressed their attack and closed to point-blank range, and the battle became a brutal melee where ships fired at distances measured in meters instead of kilometers. Minho's ship took hit after hit, and the hull plating peeled away, and fires broke out in 3 compartments, and Jisu fought to keep critical systems online, and sparks showered around her, and her hands flew across the controls rerouting power. and bypassing damaged circuits, and a plasma bolt punched through the hull beside her, and the decompression almost sucked her into space, and she grabbed a support beam and held on, and the emergency bulkhead slammed shut and sealed the breach, and she gasped for air and tasted blood and realized the pressure change had ruptured blood vessels in her lungs. The pain in Jisu's chest was intense, and every breath felt like knives, and she coughed and blood sprayed across her console, and she knew she had maybe minutes before she lost consciousness, and she looked at the damage reports and saw that their main engines were failing, and without engines they were dead in space, and she made a decision, and she grabbed her tools and crawled into the maintenance shaft that led to the engine room, and Minho shouted at her to stay at her station, and she ignored him because this was more important. Doyen's boarding pod slammed into a Torvan cruiser, and the impact jarred his teeth, and his squad blew the hatch and stormed inside, and Torvan warriors met them with plasma fire, and the corridor became a killing ground, and the Marine beside Doyen took a shot to the head and died instantly. And Doyen felt rage surge through him, and he charged forward firing, and a Torvan blade cut across his thigh and severed muscle, and he stumbled but kept moving, and his body released chemicals that numbed the pain and increased his strength, and he reached the Torvan who had cut him and broke the warrior's neck with his bare hands. Commander Krall watched the battle from his flagship, and he was troubled because his forces were winning the ship-to-ship engagement, but his boarding teams were being slaughtered, and reports kept coming in about human soldiers who refused to die and who fought with impossible ferocity. And Krall's tactical officer reported that they had destroyed or disabled 40% of the human fleet, and yet the humans were still fighting. And Krall ordered his ships to pull back and regroup, and establish safe firing distances, and his captains acknowledged and began to withdraw. Admiral Soman saw the Torvan fleet trying to disengage, and she smiled grimly, and gave her second order. And human ships that had been playing dead suddenly activated and rammed into Torvan vessels, and locked on with grappling clamps and prevented them from escaping, and more boarding pods launched, and the Torvan retreat turned into chaos. And Soman watched her displays and saw the casualty numbers climbing and felt sick, but she knew this was their only chance. Minho's ship was dying, and systems failed one after another, and he had lost contact with Jisu and feared the worst. And then the engines suddenly roared back to life, and Jisu's voice came over the intercom, weak and strained, and she said she had bypassed the damaged relays and they had thrust again, and Minho asked if she was okay, and there was a long pause. And then she said she would be fine and just get them through this battle, and Minho felt tears in his eyes and promised he would. Jisu sat in the engine room surrounded by exposed conduits and jury-rigged connections, and blood dripped from her mouth and pooled on the floor, and her entire chest felt like it was on fire, and she knew her lungs were badly damaged, and she could feel them slowly healing and tissue regenerating, and she just needed to stay conscious a little longer. And she watched the engine readouts and made adjustments and kept the power flowing and thought about her grandmother and her stories about humans who endured impossible suffering and came out stronger. Doyen's squad reached the Torvan cruiser's bridge, and they blew the doors and charged in, and Commander Krall was waiting, and he held a massive plasma cannon and fired, and the shot caught Doyen in the chest and threw him backward, and he crashed into the wall and slid down and looked at the smoking hole in his armor and the burned flesh beneath, and his body went into shock and his vision tunneled, and he heard his squad engaging Krall, and he heard screams and weapons fire, and he forced himself to breathe, and his regeneration kicked in and began repairing the catastrophic damage, and he reached for his weapon. The battle raged for 6 hours, and human ships were torn apart and reformed into new squadrons and fought again, and casualties mounted into the thousands, and yet no human fleet broke, and no human squad surrendered, and the Torvan forces began to understand that they were fighting an enemy that could not be defeated through attrition, and fear spread through their ranks. And some Torvan ships began to retreat without orders, and Commander Krall screamed commands, but his forces were crumbling. Minho's targeting systems locked onto Krall's flagship, and he fired his last missiles, and they struck the command tower, and Krall's ship lost power and began to drift, and Minho knew that this was their chance, and he contacted Admiral Soman and volunteered to lead a boarding team personally. And Soman started to refuse because he was a pilot, not a Marine, and Minho interrupted and said that he had a score to settle, and Soman understood and gave him permission. The boarding pod launched, and Minho felt the acceleration press him into his seat, and beside him were 5 Marines who looked at him with respect, because they had heard about his durability tests and his salvage mission, and they knew he would not quit no matter what happened. And the pod hit the flagship, and they breached, and Minho was first through the door and Torvan warriors rushed to meet them, and the fighting was close and desperate, and Minho took a plasma bolt to his shoulder, and ignored it and shot the Torvan who had fired and pushed forward. They fought their way to the bridge and Minho kicked in the door and found Commander Krall standing alone, and Krall's armor was damaged and he was wounded and bleeding, but he still held his weapons, and he looked at Minho and recognized him as the human from the depot, and Krall said that they would finish what they started, and Minho nodded and his marines stayed back, because this was personal. Krall charged and his blade swept toward Minho's head and Minho ducked and felt the blade pass overhead and he lunged forward and grabbed Krall's arm and they grappled and Krall was stronger and threw Minho across the bridge and Minho crashed into a console and felt ribs crack and tasted blood, and Krall advanced and brought his blade down and Minho rolled and the blade sparked off the metal floor where his head had been, and Minho swept Krall's legs and the massive Torvan fell. They fought for 10 minutes and both took terrible damage, and Krall broke Minho's jaw and cracked his skull and severed tendons in his arm, and Minho kept fighting, and his body pumped him full of adrenaline and endorphins, and he no longer felt pain and he saw only his target. And he thought about everyone who had died in the colonies and everyone fighting on the ships around him, and everyone who had trusted him to see this through, and he found strength he did not know he had. Minho caught Krall's blade hand and twisted and broke the wrist, and Krall dropped the weapon and Minho grabbed it and drove it through Krall's armor and into his chest, and Krall looked at him with something like respect and said that humans were worthy opponents, and then he died and Minho collapsed beside him and his marines rushed forward and caught him before he hit the floor, and they called for medical evacuation and told him to hold on. Across the battlefield, the Torvan forces saw their commander's flagship go dark, and they heard reports that Krall was dead, and their morale shattered, and ship after ship began to surrender, and Admiral Soman broadcast a message offering terms, and the Torvan accepted and the battle ended and humanity had won, but the cost was devastating, and over half the human fleet was destroyed or disabled, and casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Hana arrived with a Kalith coalition fleet 3 hours after the battle ended, and she had defied direct orders from the Galactic Council and convinced other species to join her. And when she saw the wreckage and the casualties, she felt guilt that she had not come sooner, and she immediately began coordinating relief efforts and providing medical supplies and ships to assist with search and rescue. And when other council members demanded she explain her actions, she told them that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Minho woke in a medical bay on Titan Station and Kyung was checking his vitals, and she smiled when she saw his eyes open and told him he had been unconscious for 2 days, and his injuries were severe, but he was healing, and she rattled off a list of broken bones and damaged organs and internal bleeding, and said that any other species would have died, but his body had repaired itself, and Minho asked about Jisoo and Kyung's smile faded, and she said Jisoo was in critical condition but stable. The great hall of the Galactic Academy Station stretched so wide that its far walls disappeared into shadow, and the ceiling glowed with artificial stars that mimicked the view outside where the station orbited a pale blue world called Sanctuary Prime, neutral ground for all the species who had joined together under the banner of the Interstellar Accord 3,000 years ago, when the Forerunners had vanished and left behind their technology and their warnings about the darkness that waited. In the spaces between galaxies, Commander Thexal stood on the raised platform at the center of the hall, and his forearms crossed over his chest in the traditional pose of authority that his people, the Vryn, had maintained since before they learned to fly between stars, and his scaled skin caught the light in patterns of deep purple and silver that marked him as a high-ranking officer who had seen combat in 17 campaigns and survived challenges that would have broken lesser beings today. Was the day that came once every decade when candidates from all 17 member species gathered to be tested by the Luminary Scanner, an artifact of the Forerunners that no one truly understood but everyone trusted, because in 3,000 years it had never failed to measure what they called the strength of will, that invisible quality that separated great leaders from ordinary soldiers and legendary heroes from competent warriors. The candidates stood in a long line that wrapped around the hall twice, and each one wore the simple gray uniform that marked them as hopefuls who had passed the physical tests and mental evaluations and political screenings that were required just to stand here, just to have this chance to be measured against the ancient standard that the Forerunners had left behind. Ji-won stood somewhere in the middle of the line and tried not to think about how their hands were shaking or how their heart pounded so hard. It felt like everyone in the hall must be able to hear it, because this was supposed to be routine, just another test, just another evaluation like all the ones back on Earth where they had scored well enough to be chosen as one of only 3 humans allowed to attend this year. Next to them stood Hunwoo, who had the broad shoulders and straight back of someone who had spent years in military training and who kept his face calm and neutral the way soldiers did when they were nervous, but did not want to show it. And behind them was Mirai, who kept muttering calculations under her breath about probability and historical statistics and how many candidates typically passed versus how many failed. The scanning process began with a deep tone that vibrated through the floor and made Jiwon's bones hum, and the first candidate approached the platform where the luminary scanner waited. A crystalline structure that rose from the floor in spirals of light and ancient metal that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states, depending on the angle you viewed it from. The candidate was a Scarix, one of the reptilian species from the hot worlds near the galactic core, and she placed her clawed hand on the scanner's surface, and the light within pulsed once, twice, 3 times, before numbers appeared in the air above the device in symbols that every species could read, because the Forerunners had built their language into the genetic memory of all intelligent life. 47. The scanner read, and Commander Thexal nodded once and gestured for the candidate to step aside, because 47 was adequate, good enough for service, high enough to show solid willpower and decent mental fortitude but nothing exceptional. Line moved forward and candidate after candidate placed their hands or tentacles or energy field projections on the scanner, and the numbers appeared, and most showed readings between 40 and 60, with a few reaching into the 70s, which caused murmurs of approval from the gathered instructors and officials who watched from the balconies above. One candidate, a floating gas being from the nebula worlds, registered 83, and the hall erupted in whispered conversation, because 83 was remarkable, the kind of score that appeared maybe once in a generation and marked someone as having the potential to become a fleet commander or planetary governor, or one of the rare individuals who could hold together alliances during times of crisis. Jiwon watched all of this and felt their nervousness grow, because these beings were impressive, powerful, capable, and what was a human doing here anyway, because everyone knew that humans were weak and short-lived, and had only joined the galactic community 40 years ago, after finally figuring out faster-than-light travel centuries after. Most other species. Hyunwoo leaned close and whispered that it would be fine, and that Jiwon had scored higher than him in every single qualification test back on Earth, and that anyone who had survived what Jiwon had survived had nothing to worry about from some ancient machine. Jiwon wanted to believe that, but their memories were not comforting. Just flashes of darkness and crushing weight and the taste of blood and concrete dust and the sound of voices crying for help, that sometimes came and sometimes did not. The line moved forward and Hyunwoo's turn came, and he placed his hand on the scanner with steady confidence, and the device pulsed and showed 61, which was solid and respectable. And he grinned as he stepped aside, because 61 meant he was in and would get to stay and train. Then Mirai approached and her hand trembled slightly as she touched the crystal surface, and the scanner showed 58, and she let out a breath she had been holding and joined Hyunwoo on the other side of the platform. Then it was Jiwon's turn, and they stepped forward on legs that felt like water, and reached out to place their hand on the scanner's surface, which was warm and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The device activated, and light spiraled up through the crystal structure, and Jiwon felt something strange, like invisible fingers reaching into their chest and touching something deep inside that they had never known was there. The light grew brighter and brighter until everyone in the hall had to shield their eyes or look away, and the humming sound grew to a roar that shook the walls and made the artificial stars in the ceiling flicker and dim. Then silence, absolute and complete silence that was somehow louder than the roar had been. Jiwon opened their eyes and saw that the scanner had frozen with light trapped inside its crystalline structure, like lightning caught in glass, and no numbers appeared in the air above it. Instead, symbols materialized, ancient symbols in the Forerunner script that no living being had seen in 3,000 years, because the Forerunners had only used this particular dialect for their most important warnings and prophecies, and the symbols hung in the air and glowed with light that hurt to look at directly. Commander Thexal stumbled backward and his forearms uncrossed in shock, and every instructor and official in the hall stood frozen, because the symbols said something that should not have been possible. Words that translated roughly into every language at once through the genetic memory that all intelligent species shared, bearer of impossible will, the symbols read, and beneath that in smaller script, measurement exceeds parameters, and beneath that in the smallest script that was barely visible, warning, reality anchor detected. The hall remained silent for a long moment, and then everyone started talking at once, and Ji-won stood with their hands still on the scanner's surface and wondered what they had done wrong, and whether this meant they had failed, and whether they would be sent back to Earth in disgrace. But Commander Thexal's expression was not anger or disappointment. It was something else entirely, something that looked like fear. They took Ji-won to a medical facility on the upper levels of the station, where the walls were white and sterile, and machines hummed quietly as they ran scan after scan trying to understand what had happened in the Great Hall and why the luminary scanner had displayed those impossible words instead of a simple number like it had for every other candidate in 3,000 years of recorded history. Bora was the human doctor assigned to monitor Ji-won's condition, and she had kind eyes and steady hands and a way of speaking that made even the most frightening test results sound manageable. And she told Ji-won that physically there was nothing wrong with them. No unusual brain activity or genetic anomalies or hidden implants or anything else that might explain why an ancient forerunner device had called them a reality anchor and declared their willpower beyond measurement. The problem was that everyone else on the station wanted to know the same thing, and within hours the news had spread through every deck and every species' diplomatic quarters, and suddenly humans were not just the newcomers who had barely figured out space travel. They were potential threats who might possess some hidden power that could upset the careful balance of the interstellar accord. Ji-won sat in the medical bay and watched through the window as ships began arriving, diplomatic vessels bearing the flags of species they had only seen in textbooks and orientation videos, and each one demanded answers about what the human candidate had done to the scanner and whether Earth had been hiding something about their species' true capabilities. Taemin arrived on the third day of Ji-won's isolation, and he was older than any human Ji-won had met before, with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent navigating the complicated politics of the galactic community. And he introduced himself as a diplomatic mentor assigned to help human candidates understand the wider universe they were joining. He sat across from Ji-won in the small room they had been given and explained that the situation was delicate because every species in the Accord had their specialty, their evolutionary advantage that made them valuable to the collective whole. And the Vryn had their strength, and the Scarix had their tactical brilliance, and the Nebula beings had their ability to process multiple timelines simultaneously, and humans had been classified as having adaptability and creativity, but nothing that would make other species nervous. But now the scanner had suggested that humans might possess something far more significant than anyone had realized. And Taemin said that throughout galactic history there had been legends about beings called anchors, who could supposedly hold reality together through sheer force of will during times of cosmic crisis, when the fabric of space itself threatened to tear apart Ji-won. Listened to all of this and felt overwhelmed because they were not special. They were just someone who had grown up in a coastal city on Earth and had volunteered for rescue services after high school, and had spent years pulling people out of collapsed buildings and flooded neighborhoods and burning structures because that was what you did when people needed help. Taemin seemed to understand, and he asked Ji-won to tell him about their worst day, and Ji-won closed their eyes and remembered the earthquake that had struck without warning and brought down the apartment complex where they had been conducting a safety inspection, and the darkness that had followed, and the weight of concrete pressing down from all sides. They had been trapped for 72 hours in a space barely large enough to breathe, and their left leg had been crushed, and they could hear voices above and below them, other people trapped in other pockets of air, and some of the voices had grown quiet as the hours passed. But Ji-won had kept talking to the ones who remained, and had kept telling them that rescue was coming, and that they just had to hold on a little longer. When the rescue team finally reached them, they found Ji-won still conscious and still talking to a young girl trapped somewhere below them, and the doctors later said that by all rights, Ji-won should have gone into shock or passed out from the pain. But somehow they had stayed aware and focused for 3 full days because giving up would have meant the girl might give up too. Taemin nodded slowly when Ji-won finished the story and said that this was what the scanner had seen. Not supernatural power or hidden genetic modification, but the simple human quality of refusing to quit, even when quitting would have been easier and more logical and perhaps more merciful. But simple or not, the galaxy was reacting and ships continued to arrive, and Ji-won could see the tension in the way the station's security forces patrolled the corridors and the way human candidates like Hyunwoo and Mirai were being watched constantly as if they might suddenly display the same impossible readings that Ji-won had produced on the 5th day. Instructor Velnon came to the medical facility and demanded to see Ji-won, and Bora tried to refuse. But the Scarix pushed past her with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. Velnon was tall even for his species, and his scales were scarred from decades of combat, and his eyes were cold and calculating as he looked at Ji-won and announced that he was invoking the ancient right of challenge because he believed the scanner had malfunctioned, and that humans were no more special than any other species, and that Ji-won would prove this by submitting to the trials of fortitude. Taemin stood immediately and said that the trials were meant for advanced students, not isolated candidates who had not even been officially accepted to the academy, and that they were dangerous and designed to break even the strongest wills. Velnon smiled with too many teeth and said that was exactly the point, because if Ji-won truly possessed impossible willpower, then the trials would not break them, and if the scanner had been wrong, then everyone would know, and the dangerous rumors about human potential would be put to rest. Ji-won looked at Taemin and then at Bora, and then at Velnon, and felt the weight of expectation pressing down like concrete and rubble, and they heard themselves say that they would accept the challenge because refusing would only make things worse and would paint all humans as cowards who hid behind diplomatic protection. Taemin grabbed Ji-won's shoulder and said quietly that no candidate had ever completed all 5 trials, and that those who failed often came out changed in ways that never fully healed. But Ji-won had already made up their mind because they had not come all the way from Earth to hide in a medical facility and let other people make decisions about their future and about humanity's place in the stars. The news spread faster than before, and by evening, the entire station knew that a human candidate would face the trials of fortitude, and Hyunwoo came to visit and said he would request to take the trials in Ji-won's place because he had more combat training and psychological conditioning. Ji-won refused because this was not about combat skills, and Hyunwoo knew it, and Miri came next and brought books and records about the trials, and explained that only 17 candidates had ever attempted all 5 trials, and only 3 had completed more than 3, and none had finished all 5 without permanent psychological damage. The trials would begin in 3 days, and Ji-won spent those days training with Bora, who taught meditation techniques and mental exercises, and Taemin, who explained the philosophy behind each trial, and what the Forerunners had been trying to measure when they designed these tests thousands of years ago. On the night before the trials began, Ji-won could not sleep and stood at the window looking out at the stars and thought about all the people back on Earth who were counting on the candidates to represent humanity well, and about the girl they had talked to through 72 hours of darkness, and whether she had grown up strong, or whether the trauma had broken. Something inside her that never healed. A voice behind them said that fear was natural. And Ji-won turned to find a Vrin student standing in the doorway, and she introduced herself as Yeji, and said she had been studying humans since they joined the Accord because she found their culture fascinating and their determination inspiring, even though her instructors had always dismissed humans as insignificant. Yeji said that she would be watching the trials and that she believed Ji-won could succeed because she had studied human history and seen how this species survived ice ages and plagues and wars and climate disasters, and always somehow found a way forward when any logical species would have accepted extinction. Ji-won thanked her, and Yeji left, and the station's artificial night cycle continued, and morning came too quickly with its promise of trials designed by the Forerunners to break the strongest wills in the galaxy. The first trial chamber was a vast circular room with walls that seemed to stretch forever in every direction, and the floor was smooth and featureless, except for a single glowing line that marked the path forward, and Instructor Velnon stood at the entrance with his arms crossed and explained in a voice that carried to every corner that this was called the Endless March, and that candidates would walk forward while the chamber projected their deepest fears and greatest regrets directly into their minds until they could no longer continue. Most candidates lasted 30 minutes before the psychological pressure became too much, and they collapsed or retreated or simply stood frozen, unable to take another step forward. And Velnon said this with satisfaction, as if he had already decided that Jiwan would fail within the first hour. Jiwan stepped onto the glowing path, and immediately the world shifted, and they were back in the darkness under the collapsed building with concrete, pressing against their chest and the smell of dust and blood filling their lungs and the sound of voices crying for help that grew quieter and quieter as the hours passed. But this was not memory. This was something worse, because the trial showed them every person they had failed to save, and every moment they had arrived too late, and every decision they had made that had led to someone else's suffering, and the voices whispered that it was their fault, and that they should have been faster, and stronger and better. Jiwan walked forward, and the scenes changed, and they saw their family back on Earth, looking at the news reports about the scanner incident, and feeling afraid of what their child had become. And they saw Hyunwoo and Mirai being questioned by security forces who suspected all humans of hiding dangerous abilities. And they saw Earth being isolated from the galactic community because of the fear that one person had generated. The path seemed to stretch forever, and Jiwan's legs ached and their lungs burned, but they kept walking because stopping would mean accepting that these visions were true, and they knew that fear and regret were real, but they did not have to be paralyzing, and that guilt was heavy, but it could be carried if you kept moving forward. 3 hours passed, and the watching instructors began to murmur among themselves, because most candidates had already failed, and Jiwan was still walking, and the monitoring equipment showed that their heart rate was elevated and their stress hormones were through the roof, but their pace never slowed. 6 hours passed, and Bora was standing at the observation window with her hands pressed against the glass because she could see that Jiwan was exhausted, and that their body was reaching its limits, but they kept walking and kept putting one foot in front of the other. 8 hours passed, and the trial chamber finally released its hold, and Jiwan stumbled across the finish line and collapsed to their knees, and Taemin rushed forward to help them stand, but Jiwan waved him away and stood on their own, because accepting help now would feel like admitting they had reached their breaking point. Velnon's expression showed something between respect and frustration, and he announced that the second trial would begin after a rest period of 6 hours, and that this trial was called the Weight of Worlds, and would test physical endurance under increasing gravitational pressure. Jiwan spent those 6 hours in the medical bay while Bora ran scans and provided hydration and nutrition supplements, and told them that they had pushed their body harder than was safe, and that continuing might cause permanent damage. But Jiwan had not come this far to stop, and when the time came, they walked into the second trial chamber, which was smaller than the first and filled with equipment that generated artificial gravity fields that could be adjusted to simulate the conditions on any planet in the known galaxy. The trial was simple in concept and brutal in execution because candidates had to carry an object across the chamber, while the gravity increased in stages, and most species had evolved on worlds with relatively light gravity, so their bodies were adapted to move easily and efficiently under those conditions. Humans had evolved on Earth, which was a relatively high-gravity world compared to most inhabited planets, but that advantage meant little when the gravity field was cranked up to 3 times Earth normal, and then 4 times, and then 5 times, until every step felt like moving through liquid metal, and breathing required conscious effort. Jiwan lifted the weight that they had been assigned and started walking, and their muscles screamed in protest and their bones felt like they might crack under the pressure. But they took one step, and then another, and focused on nothing except moving forward, because thinking about the distance remaining would have been overwhelming. Other candidates who had stronger bodies and better natural advantages passed Jiwan quickly and finished the trial in minutes, but when the gravity increased beyond what their species could handle, they stopped trying. Jiwan kept going even when their legs gave out and they fell to their knees and the instructors expected them to give up. But instead, Jiwan started crawling forward with the weight clutched against their chest and their body shaking with effort. Yeji watched from the observation area and whispered that this was insane and beautiful, and exactly what her instructors had always said was impossible because humans were supposed to be weak and logical, and willing to accept their limitations. But G1 did not accept limitations, and they crawled the final meters to the finish line and collapsed with blood running from their nose and their vision blurring at the edges. Bora insisted on a full day of rest before the third trial, and Velnon reluctantly agreed because killing a candidate would create diplomatic incidents that even he wanted to avoid. The third trial was called the Isolation Chamber, and it was exactly what it sounded like. A sensory deprivation chamber where candidates were sealed in complete darkness and silence, with nothing but their own thoughts for company. And most lasted a few hours before the lack of stimulation drove them to demand release. G1 entered the E chamber knowing that this might be easier than the physical trials because they had spent 72 hours trapped under rubble and had learned how to exist in darkness and silence and how to keep their mind occupied with memories and plans and imagined conversations. The hours stretched into days, and the monitoring equipment showed that G1 remained conscious and stable and calm in a way that should not have been possible, because the isolation chamber was designed to break down mental barriers and force candidates to confront every fear and doubt and weakness. But G1 had already confronted those things during the endless march, and had learned that fears were just thoughts, and thoughts could be acknowledged and set aside, and so they spent the time in darkness thinking about everyone they wanted to help, and every bridge they wanted to build between species, and every reason they had come to the academy in the first place. 6 days passed, and the instructors began to worry that something had gone wrong with the chamber, because no one had ever lasted this long, and Velnon finally ordered the trial ended, because continuing served no purpose except to prove what everyone already knew. When they opened the chamber, G1 walked out blinking in the light but otherwise unharmed, and immediately asked when the fourth trial would begin. The instructors held an emergency meeting, and Mirai, who had been researching Forerunner history in the Academy archives, discovered something disturbing in ancient texts that described the luminary scanner and the trials of fortitude. The text said that the Forerunners had created the scanner to identify beings they called anchors, who possessed willpower so strong that it could literally affect reality and hold civilizations together during existential crises. And the trials had been designed not to train these anchors, but to identify them, because only someone with impossible will could complete all 5 trials. Mirai brought this information to Taemin, and together they tried to reach G1 to warn them that the remaining trials might be more dangerous than anyone had realized. But they were too late because Velnon had already scheduled the 4th trial to begin immediately, and G1 had already entered the chamber, which was sealed and could not be opened until the trial was complete or the candidate surrendered. The 4th trial was called the Sacrifice Scenario, and it placed candidates in a simulation where they had to make impossible choices and save some people while watching others die, and the trial was designed to last 1 hour, during which candidates would face 3 such scenarios and make their choices and then live. With the consequences, G1 entered the simulation and saw the first scenario, which showed a burning building with 2 groups of people trapped on opposite sides, and time to save only one group before the structure collapsed. Instead of choosing, G1 tried to save both groups and failed, and the simulation reset and showed the scenario again, and G1 tried a different approach and failed again. The trial was supposed to force candidates to make hard choices and accept that some people could not be saved, but G1 refused to accept this and kept trying different solutions and different strategies and different ways of approaching the problem. 1 hour passed, and then 10 hours, and then 20 hours, and G1 was still running scenarios and still trying to find the solution that would save everyone. And the simulation's computer systems began to struggle with the sheer number of variations and permutations that G1 was attempting.